Well, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. I am incredibly excited to be able to talk with our guest today because when I met this individual, they truly inspired me because of their lived experience, but more importantly, their mission that they're having in the world. And so today I've got Mathew Brown, a commanding officer in the U.S. Navy, a SEAL team member, an innovator, a mental health advocate, a fly fishing guide, which I thought was really cool as well. But more importantly is the founder and CEO of Chimney Trail. Mathew, thank you so much for being with us here, man. I really appreciate it.
Keenan, I'm pumped to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So when you and I first met, we connected on a shared passion for mental health. We hopped on a Zoom call together, but more importantly, the things that you told me about your lived experience and why you're so passionate about Chimney Trail, but more importantly, mental health in general, I think needs to be shared. And I want you to kind of share the opening story about your experience in coming back and learning that one of your younger comrades had made a decision that impacted not only himself, his family, but also you. Would you mind giving us an introduction to kind of that story that you shared with me the first time we met?
Definitely. So, Keenan, as your listeners might be interested to know, and as you mentioned a second ago, I was the captain of one of our Navy ships in San Diego, California, and it was an incredible tour. It was a really rich, professionally rewarding experience and a great way to serve. But in that tour, I had an experience that sort of shaped the trajectory of what I'm imagining to be the rest of my life, and that's that one of our very best young officers, I had finished up with my command tour and went to work for SEAL Team 17, and 2 months into that job, I got a call from the ship, and it turns out that young officer, one of our very best, had gone to a Marine Corps exchange, purchased a firearm, and had taken his own life. And this was one of those things that was like absolutely shocking because everybody wants to think or wants to believe that they can identify someone who's having these sorts of feelings or is on sort of a path to dying by suicide, and this was not the case. In fact, if you would have come on and asked me, "Hey, Captain, like point me in the direction of somebody who could use some mental health intervention," I would have grabbed this kid and been like, "Hey, help me think of somebody." Like it would have never have been him. And so he didn't pass away immediately. So I went to the hospital. The ship that he was assigned to, that I used to be in command of, was actually out to sea. So the new captain of the ship called me and said, "Hey man, can you go sit with his parents at the hospital? Because this guy was, first of all, his name is Arun Somasundaram. And Arun's family was from India, and they had come obviously to be at his bedside at the hospital. And so I went and I sat with his parents. And as you might imagine, his mom was inconsolable. But his dad was able to talk at least, and he kept bringing up this team building exercise that we did together where I took all of the officers on my ship to Yosemite National Park, and we climbed Cathedral Peaks together, which is this really cool cluster of mountains in Yosemite. And his dad grabbed me by the shoulders, and he sort of shook me, not sort of, he did, he shook me, and he said, "Why didn't I do these things with my son? Why didn't I do these things with my beautiful son?" And I think if you would have asked me at that point in time, like, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I was finding a lot of value in service to our Navy. It's a wonderful way to serve. But on my drive home from that experience, I called my wife, Jen, and I said, "Listen, hon, I think we might need to take a different path." And not only are we seeing it with Arun and some of the sailors on my ship, but more broadly, the military and veteran community needs a mental health care advocate. We need a healthcare company that specifically addresses their needs, and I think we need to start that. There's a lot of companies that are sort of nipping around the edges, but we need somebody that is just going to do like a full-blown assault on pathological anxiety, depression. And she is an amazing woman, and she was like, "Okay, let's go do that." So I called my co-founders after that. And then we started Chimney Trail, which you know, and your listeners will soon find out, is a company that's designed to make cognitive behavioral therapy easily accessible and not something that you need to wait in line for. It's just a way of improving your mental state through self-paced, self-led cognitive behavioral therapy.
I mean, I think that your story is so inspirational because you have the lived experience. And just to be the talk in common form, when we think about people who are in the military, we think of these tough guys. We think of these people who are just like roughnecks, the people who are willing to be on the front lines and sacrifice everything to protect our freedom, but more importantly, protect everything that we know as Americans. And one of those conversations that I've been experiencing since 2014 is the mental health struggles of people who are in these positions. So from your perspective as a leader, what was one of like your early aha moments where you realized that there were mental health struggles, there were pressures, there was stress that your people, your comrades were dealing with that maybe kind of first turned your lights on to the struggles that other people were going for? Just like you were talking about with one of your young captains, naturally it's the people who we don't expect need the support actually need it more than the people who seem to be struggling. So what was one of your earliest experiences where you realized that mental health was a real challenge and it wasn't just an accumulation of just this lived experience?
Yeah, man. So I think, the biggest aha moment for me was that, and this might come as a surprise to your listeners, is that when you think of mental health care challenges in the U.S. military, you do sort of bias toward that very description that you had of the military person, like the roughneck, tough, like very physical, wanting to go out and do the nation's bidding in a very physical sort of way. There are traumatic events that you can experience in uniform. Certainly I've experienced my fair share of traumatic events in uniform just from a combat-related standpoint that can bring on or precipitate mental health challenges. But the thing that is the aha moment is that it's not always a traumatic, like PTSD sort of event. A lot of times what happens is that you've got a young, energetic person who is entering the military for any number of reasons. It could be for to advance their family's economic prospects. It could be to get an education. It could, whatever their circumstances are, they're fully invested in this vocation, and they have an idea of what that vocation is going to be, like what their experience is going to be. But the military is a huge place, and there's lots of different types of jobs. Some of them are super glamorous, like Top Gun Maverick and SEAL Team 6 and all that kind of stuff. And then there's basic blocking and tackling of running the organization, making the lights turn on and off every day. And I think what happens sometimes is that you've got these war fighters, and their mentality is that they're going to go out hard charging. And when their reality doesn't marry up with what their vision for their service was going to be, it leads them into a profoundly dark place. And if you don't prepare them for that and give them tools to honor their service in the form that it's taking in that moment, they can feel they can lose their passion for their service and frankly lose their passion for life. The second aha moment was that everybody talks about the honor and privilege that it is to be willing to give it all for your country, and people are like, these folks are willing to die for their country. And from my perspective, having lived a really varied military experience, it's just as important, it's more important to be willing to live for your country. A lot of people go in okay, the standard is to die for your country, like Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump. But it's no, man, you got to live for your country. So that's, I think, my two epiphanies, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, let's talk about the first aha moment. And this is something that I didn't really recognize until you started to talk about it, but the realization that maybe your idea of what serving your country is going to align with or look like, and then your actual role and position doesn't align with that. And I'm guessing that there's a sense of turmoil that says this is maybe not what I signed up for. Now I'm committed to a long-term commitment. I'm not passionate about this. Do you see that commonly throughout, your experiences with your other individuals that you engage with, or what does that look like for the common man, for the more common person? Is that something that a lot of people experience? Because this is the first time that it's really been kind of brought to my attention that that's something that, from my perspective, would be very taxing on me. If I signed up for one thing, it didn't align with that. Now I'm kind of stuck in this middle place.
Yeah, man. It's 100% of the people, including the people who are Top Gun Maverick and SEAL Team 6. When you are developing your idea of what military service is, you almost forget about the service part. and you're thinking about military action. And so you watch these different movies that give you an idea of what your service is going to look like. And those movies, like the stuff that's happening in them, might happen to you over the course of a 20-year career. It definitely doesn't happen to you over the course of an hour-and-a-half long movie. So it's like you're waiting for this like super high energy experience to happen. But the reality is that the way that you should approach it is more like a samurai. Like they did, very disciplined, very routine practice every single day. And then in a moment where, their services were needed, they fell back to their habits. They didn't rise to an occasion. Instead, they retreated to the habits that they had created through their very disciplined training. And I think that if folks entered the service with this sort of like samurai type mentality where, hey, I might be using a needle gun to remove rust from the side of a ship, but I'm removing that rust in the same way that like the Karate Kid did wax on, wax off. Like if you could approach it in that mental state, then you'd be much better off. But most folks, they don't. They just have this like Hollywood idea of what they're about to step off on, and then we let them down inevitably. And this is coming from, I've been associated with the Navy for almost 20 years and have seen a bunch of stuff. And I can even tell you from my perspective, there are more like deliberate, slow-paced, discipline opportunities sort of days than there ever are like armed conflict. So, yeah.
And that makes sense. I think about kind of even as I look out from the outsider's perspective about how technology in itself has kind of influenced the way in which we fight battles today, right? We grew up on the ideas of going to the front lines and being in the trenches and fighting door to door, like early Afghanistan days, if you will. But now when we see things that come down to military conflicts from the consumer, the regular person's perspective, I think of drones. I think of airstrikes. And maybe there's not as many, I guess, hand-to-hand or frontline combat actions that kind of are involved in the military process. And I can understand if that's what I got into or that's what I signed up for and I don't get to participate in that, that would be definitely a letdown for me. I remember there was a movie a couple of years ago that I watched. It was called Jarhead, and it was about a Marine sniper who goes throughout his deployment and never actually gets to fire his weapon. And by the end of the movie, he seems very distraught from a mental perspective because he's not living up to what he thought he was going to be doing. And that was kind of one of my early, I guess, subconscious experiences, now recognizing that I'm talking to you, that frustration that actually starts to happen there, which is very interesting.
It's the interesting thing, and I think it's like the unspoken genesis of military and veteran mental health care issues. And frankly, I don't think that it's just military and veteran. I think it's like everybody. So right now, 1 in 10 kids born today is going to make an attempt on their own life before they graduate high school. And to me, like this is the most shocking statistic. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has come out and he said, look, adolescent mental health care is the defining healthcare crisis of our time. Not just mental health care crisis, but this specific thing is the healthcare crisis of our time. And I think it's not just military circles, it's also everybody. Like you go on Instagram and you have this idea of what life should manifest for you as, and when your reality is not matching up to that, it creates this disconnect where you feel like maybe like this permanent solution to a very temporary problem is my only path. And at Chimney Trail, we're trying to make sure that people don't suffer the distortions that lead them to suicide, and instead give them a more like realistic view of what life should be and what they can make of it. Give them some hope.
Yeah. Recentering, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, is, the expectation that we have for how things should be based on what everybody else tells us what they could be is a very dangerous game to be in. And, we were fortunate enough. I'm 32 years old. How old are you, Mathew?
40.
40. Cool.
Yep.
So you and I both came up in the generation before all the social media impact, the influence that it had over us, both consciously and subconsciously. So I very much do worry about that social media conversation, because it seems like people are being rewarded more today for putting on a mask of everything is great, I'm making all this money, I'm doing all this amazing stuff, when it doesn't align with actually who they are. And I think naturally we can kind of intuitively pick up on that. And naturally it's starting to create these, I would say, swelling effects in the mental health of the youth, the first generation who's been growing up on these platforms like Instagram. And it just creates such a dichotomy between where I think I should be and where I am. And sometimes I guess stepping away and kind of having a conversation like you're talking about, being able to reframe the paradigm of our expectations is so vital and important. But who's doing the work out there to help us do that stuff? You know what I mean? Like, who is the person having that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of good people having the conversation. I know that the Surgeon General right now is talking about like, hey, if social media companies are not incentivized to really create safety within their application for audiences that are 13 years of age and younger, do we need to do something from a public policy standpoint or a public healthcare standpoint to address it? Certainly there's probably some room for that. Yeah, another thing is just parents or guardians or mentors in kids' lives, making sure that they're engaging with the kid so that they know that what you see is not necessarily the reality. And I think that you and I probably have a better perspective on this than most, because in the entrepreneurial space, you are constantly putting on like the best possible show on behalf of your company. So like, yeah, we're super high growth, we're super this, we're super that. And it's like, nobody really talks about the fact that your family's eating ramen noodles every night while you try to figure out how to make ends meet. So there's this really unglamorous side of it that like you don't really celebrate, because you need to advance your company and, capture revenue and do all the things that make companies go. But if you're engaging with kids, making sure that they understand that what they're seeing on social media is a truly distorted reality, and that life is way more rich in a non-like broadcast sort of way. Yeah,
I truly believe that as well. And I want to use that as a perfect transition to kind of talk about your entrepreneurial journey before we start diving into kind of the background and the inspiration, the process of building Chimney Trail. So, entrepreneur now, on an amazing mission to save lives, but more importantly, start spreading awareness around the importance of mental health and mental health awareness and understanding. What was kind of your expectation for being an entrepreneur, starting a company, and did it align with what you thought? And what has it been really like?
I mean, I think I knew that it was going to be hard. So on the one hand, it did align with what I thought. But I'll just say it this way, like I've served in combat operations. I've been the captain of a U.S. Navy warship, and this project is the hardest thing I've ever done. There's no doubt about it. Being an entrepreneur, I don't recommend it. Like if you're a kid out there and you're like, what am I going to do with my life? I think that what ends up happening is that you have this passion for solving a problem. And then if you decide to create a company in order to address that problem, you end up making a company rather than solving that problem. Like your day is spent making a company, which on the one hand is tremendously valuable because I can bring in experts to help out with what it is that we're doing. But some part of me does think, my gosh, I wish that I could just go work for the Walt Disney Company, leverage all of their resources and figure out how to tackle this with like a fully complete product, that sort of thing. So it did measure up to like my expectation in the sense that it was going to be impossibly difficult. But one thing I will admit to is that I thought it was going to happen a little bit faster. I mean, we've been working on this project since 2018. The first 3 years of it, we ended up being in research mode because we just could not find the right solution to the problem. We knew that we needed to get cognitive behavioral therapy in people's hands in a very low barrier to entry sort of way. We just didn't know how to do it. But we partnered with the right doctors that pointed us in the right direction, and now we're making some headway. But so yeah, I mean, I guess it's lived up to all the hype. I will admit that there's one part of that that's way different. I thought that I was going to be like, I know that you have an athletic background. I played a lot of sports, was in the military, which is a very competition-based organization. And I thought in my head, entrepreneurial space, they say like 99% of businesses die. And I thought it was because like other businesses were just kicking your butt, when in reality, 99% die because you just need to endure. You just need to like stay in the fight. And so that's been a real eye-opening experience to me, is just like the grit that it takes to just keep going. Even when you feel like it's dead, you just keep going.
And that's a huge part of entrepreneurship that I think a lot of people don't understand. It's literally a game of survival. From the perspective of, if you are doing the work consistently, you will be successful, but there are going to be tough days. And we've both been through the ups and downs of the entrepreneurial journey, asking for support from the people who you love, and honestly, kind of being crazy enough to push forward an idea that you know is going to create value, but getting the right people around you is also so vitally important. So let's use this as an opportunity to kind of talk about what you mentioned, finding the right solution. Take me through some of the early days in looking at the marketplace, looking at the solutions that were out there, and then realizing maybe this isn't going to get the job done. How did you guys go to the whiteboard and start recognizing we need to bring in the types of professionals who understand best practice? What type of solutions are out there? What was that early research discovery phase like for you guys?
Yeah, so I think for us, we were more insulated from the general marketplace, because when we first started the project, I was still in uniform. Okay. And so I wasn't really thinking about the marketplace. I was thinking about my old ship. I was thinking about the SEAL team that I was assigned to at that moment in time. And I was just like, it doesn't seem like there's a solution that addresses this, like what we're dealing with for these audiences. Which is not to say that there were not millions of amazing resources. Like there were so many wonderful, well-intentioned people that were trying to like tackle this problem. But the issue was that their solutions were sort of specific to an area where their research was, or it was only for like this small group of people, or whatever the case might be. And so I just started looking at what our sailors had available to them in a non-clinical way. And the reason that I was focused on a non-clinical solution is because the number of people in need of mental health care services and the number of providers there to actually like give services, there's always a huge mismatch there. It's like, 20-1 or something like that, depending on the study that you read. So we said, okay, whatever we create, it can't be relying on like a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It needs to be informed by that expertise, but we can't be relying on their hours. We need to productize what it is that they do. So rather than getting psychiatric services, we need a psychiatric product. And so initially it was just like, what is the most scientifically vetted solution for preventing mental illness? We wanted to take sort of a preventive approach, and all of them came back and said cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is essentially an understanding that the pathological feelings of anxiety and depression that you have are created by a cognition. And if you can separate those two and analyze the cognition, you realize that most of the time, if you're suffering anxiety and depression, the thought that created it is wildly illogical. So we said, okay, let's train people on that, because I know coming up through the military ranks, I was never trained on that stuff. So let's get the training in their hands. And then once we figured that out, then it was sort of like, okay, is it via email? Is it via an app? And then we did get like on the road to this app solution. And then we discovered that there was this huge body of research that talked about marrying up problem-solving therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And if you can, like Ben Franklin always says, his quote is, if you want me to forget, tell me. If you want me to maybe remember, teach me. If you want me to actually remember, involve me. And so we knew that we needed to create a product that really inspired involvement. And so that's sort of what led us down the experiential CBT path that we're on with Chimney Trail.
I love that. I mean, there's so many things to unpack in what you just said. Since I got in the mental and behavioral health space in 2014, I recognized the shortage of providers that we have and the demand that is needed for the services that need to be rendered. And there's a famous saying in healthcare, a lot of people talk about it. It's like, but we cannot hire our way out of this problem, right? Because there are not enough professionals who are there to meet the demand. And I think when it comes to meeting the demand of so many people and the needs that they have, you have to productize the solution that can reach more people, because like you said, we're never going to be able to trade time for services. We'll never be able to catch up that way. And so I love what you guys are doing in going out and partnering with these, these professionals who understand what needs to happen. Who were some of the first organizations and or people you looked to for some of this expertise and pointing you in the direction of cognitive behavioral therapy? What was that like?
Yeah, so this is like a tremendously charmed path. Like, I do not anticipate that every entrepreneur who enters the solution finding space will have this level of talent at their disposal. But a former landlord of mine, her name is Dr. Ann Wilson. She was a professor her study was like in utero development and the transmission of trauma from generation to generation, through genetic factors. And I just called her ideation phase. I was like, hey, I'm trying to solve this problem. And she told me, she's like, look, if you want to solve this, you just need to have them do an activity. And honestly, it needs to put them in an unfamiliar environment. And so we sort of settled on the outdoor space. But to her point, she said, hey, you could go through a hardware store if you want. It just needs to be someplace unfamiliar, and then present these concepts, these resilience building concepts to them. So that was Dr. Ann Wilson. We leveraged the entire network that the military has in place for fleet and family support services. So there were a lot of doctors involved in that. And then we have Dr. Bob Dudas, who's the chief of academic pediatric medicine for Johns Hopkins. He looked at the product and he's like, look, we don't need to overcomplicate this. It just needs to be something that people are compelled to do, that will teach them about the way to think clearly and to remove the cognitive distortions that cause anxiety and depression. And then we met Dr. Lindsay Orkowski from Brown through a mutual friend, and she is a clinical researcher at Brown, and she actually does a lot of sexual assault prevention and community safety measure research for Brown. And then the network effect just sort of took root. And now we're working with Dr. Leah Blaine from the Cohen Institute at University of Pennsylvania, which is a psychological support services entity of UPenn that specifically addresses military and veteran mental health related issues. So wow. I probably forgot one or two people in there, and I apologize to them. But yeah, it was just this wonderful network effect where once you got into it, people are like, oh, this person is actually trying to solve the problem, and they're not selling snake oil, and they're not trying to oversell. They're just trying to provide a productized solution. Let's get on board.
Yeah, I think naturally, and everybody who's listening and watching today can easily understand the passion that you come from in your lived experience. And that's why I wanted to start the introduction today with your lived experience and the things that you've done. Because when you find something that you are truly passionate about, and you know how it's going to impact not only the people who you can directly impact, but also their family members, their circle of friends, you're doing such amazing work that it makes sense that people want to get on board. And so I just want to, publicly take a second to commend you guys for the amazing work that you're doing, because it is so needed. And we don't have a lot of organizations and people out there who are making a true impact like you guys are. And I just want to say thank you so much, Matthew. You're doing some amazing stuff.
Keenan, you're the man. Thanks so much for the boost. And thanks for giving us a platform, man, giving us an opportunity to give voice to this problem and encourage people to sort of help solve it.
Absolutely. So a couple things that you mentioned there, and I think this is very interesting. There was a phenomenon that was happening in Vietnam where 25% of U.S. soldiers who had been deployed to Vietnam had tried heroin. And the U.S. government became incredibly alarmed about the fact that 1 in 4 individuals was overseas trying heroin. But something amazing happened when these people came back from their deployment was, I want to say it was a small number, only 1% or 2% of the people over in Vietnam came back and actually tried heroin in the United States. And they talk about how our environment has a gigantic impact on our ability to adapt to new thoughts and or trigger certain environmental triggers that bring up habits and different things like that. So when you're talking about getting people into a new experiential experience, why is that such an emphasis? And was that something you experienced in some of your leadership retreats by taking people outside of the stresses of their normal everyday to day? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Man, this is a great question. You clearly did your research. So I have a family history of mental illness, like close, like first degree of separation between me and family, suffered major depressive disorder, clinical anxiety and depression. I have a younger cousin who was addicted to opioids and took his own life. And so independent, sort of the catalyst event that launched Chimney Trail, like I had all of this like past that certainly like that experience has informed my worldview. I've managed depressive symptoms like basically my entire life. So this is not something that is foreign to me. It's not like I'm this outside entity who's casting judgment on folks that are suffering with this. It's like I'm like the beneficiary of my own product, so to speak. And so one of the things about like heroin, and you might read about like psychedelic drugs that are being used now to sort of get people out of these thought patterns that they've like buried themselves in, is that we talked about a second ago how pathological anxiety and depression is generated by a cognition. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And those cognitions, if you just think something one time and never think it again, it's like the most transient, immaterial thing ever. It's not a big deal. The real challenge comes when you think something over and over and over again, and that rumination creates like a ditch, and you can't get out of the ditch. Every time you think it, you dig the ditch an inch deeper, and if you think it over and over again, pretty soon you're like in the Grand Canyon because you can't think about anything else. And so you need something to get you the hell out of the Grand Canyon. And so stuff like heroin or psychedelics, like those are like a chemical way of rewiring your brain for better or for worse. Like I do not advise going and doing heroin right now or anything for that matter. What CBT does is it puts you in the driver's seat of your own, of like controlling your own brain. And when you get into these ruminations that are full of illogical thought patterns, CBT allows you to analyze that thought pattern and decide on a different path. So the classic example is you're an 11-year-old kid who has an algebra test coming up. You take it, you fail it, and then your brain starts the process of digging this ditch, which says, I am a failure. That's in the clinical space, they'll call that all or nothing thinking. It's like, I'm either a success or I am a failure. And you're making that determination on because you failed a math test. That's a patently illogical thought. So you have to train your brain to think, hey, I failed that math test. That doesn't mean I'm a failure. It means I failed that math test and I need to work hard on like factoring or whatever the algebra thing was that you failed. And then what that does is it takes you out of the ditch and puts you back on, stable ground. So I don't know. I think, there's, the psychiatric drug piece of this, I think, is very important. I'm not like saying don't go see a psychiatrist and get prescriptions, because sometimes you need those prescriptions to get out of the ditch. But the CBT is like maybe like mountain climbing equipment, so you can climb your way out of the ditch like on your own. And then there's a lot of studies that say if you can do it in this sort of very manual, self-directed way, that the likelihood of it lasting is greater. And I can just speak from personal experience that it's made a hell of a lot of difference in my life.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I appreciate you sharing, your history and your family history and some of your lived experience. I think that's incredibly valuable. I always get super charged up when I hear people who are in a space who have lived experience there. One of the issues that I find in healthcare in general is that because there's always a need to innovate, a lot of products, a lot of solutions come from being produced in a vacuum, in a laboratory somewhere. We're like, this is best practice. I'm going to put this into the marketplace and see how it performs. And I find that the best solutions come from those who have lived experience and can actually speak about the impact of the solutions that they're leveraging. And I think that's so incredible. You know, I'm truly inspired by the beginning of our conversation today when you talked about the father of the individual who ended up dying by suicide, who shook you and said, I can't believe I never took my son on these trips. Talk about these trips and kind of what the experience is like with people who you take on them, and kind of, you know, the shared experience of being able to bond together in a new environment that is not military based or so, I would say, regimented. What was some of that like?
So this is like a whole different podcast. Like, we could talk about leadership and how to build a team and how to create a shared ethos among the people who are expected to advance toward a common cause. And one of the things that when you're building a team, you have to do is create a shared vocabulary. It's helpful to have something called sacred artifacts, which are just like an object that you can look at that reminds you that you're on this team. So there's shared language, there's sacred artifacts, and then there is shared experiences. And the shared experiences, Chimney Trail exists to create a shared experience around the whole idea of mental health and wellness and cognitive behavioral therapy. So when we went to Yosemite, like, I wasn't the CEO of a mental health care company. I didn't know like that there was mental health benefit to what we were doing. I knew that I needed to take, 25 young military officers and get them on the same page, because we had a really rigorous 2 years ahead of us and we needed to get like our act together. So what the event was for was to create a bonding, a shared experience where we knew that we were going to face some challenges. We would help overcome them together. Later, as we were facing challenges as a ship, I would be able to say, oh, remember that time on Yosemite where we did X, Y, and Z. And of course, we collected some things. We, like, on the ship, we had like the flags that we took up the mountain when we climbed Yosemite. So we had those sacred artifacts as well. And so that was just like team building 101, to have like the shared language, the sacred artifact, the shared experience. But from a mental health care company, we said we need to recreate that somehow so that people have this shared language, sacred artifact, and shared experience around cognitive behavioral therapy, processes for overcoming the distortions that cause anxiety, depression, and suicide. What does that look like? And that's why our product is like super tangible. It's literally a box. Like, we ship it to you and you open it up and there's stuff in it. And then we would be relying on a service like FRANSiS, for example, to help to continue the shared language part of this thing. So there's this vocabulary that we need to get familiar with: cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive distortions. There's 10 of them. Each of them, leads to anxiety and depression in their own special way. Like, we all got to know about these things in order to not fall victim to them. As soon as you name it, you can overcome it. And so that's sort of what the Yosemite experience was about, and then how we've applied it to Chimney Trail.
And I think that's, the biggest thing, and why I kind of host the podcast and want to have people on the show like you, is we have to redefine the experience of mental health. Growing up an athlete, you had mentioned that I have an athletic career, you have an athletic career. I never had the shared experience of having common language to be able to describe what mental health was. And as I was kind of preparing for our conversation today, I was just thinking about so much of the work that you and I do is really kind of rewriting that narrative into language and experiences that people can share in, to understand that, oh, maybe I wasn't feeling upset, angry, stressed in that moment. Maybe this was a sign of my mental health. And I feel like from the male perspective, from being an athlete, from being in the military, we have to do so much work to break down barriers, to destigmatize the conversation, to put it in a light that is more approachable. Because, me personally, coming from a biracial background, African-American father, white mother, I saw how an entire generation and multi-generations of my family stigmatized these types of conversations because we didn't have a common experience or language that we could approach them with. And I think the work that you're doing to be on the front lines, and even talking about your leadership retreat, right, does so much work in reframing these narratives and stories that we have in our head to be more efficient, but more importantly, more supportive, so we can break down some of these barriers. I think that's just vital.
I think you're right on the money, man. And so our initial product is very like nature centric, because there's a real therapy, like a clinically proven therapeutic benefit to being like in nature. But the very next step for us is taking this CBT curriculum and making it accessible to baseball teams, football teams, and giving the coach, not trying to turn them into a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but to give the coach the language that they need to use in order to rescue someone from like their own negative mental self-image. Like the faster that you can overcome these distortions, the more productive you can be as an athlete, as someone in the workplace, and like even independent, the whole being productive thing, you can just be happier. Like you can genuinely you can feel better about everything. You don't feel like you're on this like ladder that you need to somehow get to the top of, or this mountain that you need to scale like as fast as humanly possible. Instead, you start like looking around and appreciating the view as you're climbing the mountain. And then before you know it, like you're almost accidentally at the top of it. And it's because you've been in this healthy space the entire time. And, you know, healthy mental states just breeds success.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You know, strategically, in a lot of my conversations, when we talk about the work we do at FRANSiS, you know, we speak about creating opportunities for conversations. And kind of to go back to what I was talking about before you started talking there are so many stigmas that we have internally, culturally, in our social groups that stop us from having conversations. And one of the biggest things that we can do is enable people with frameworks that have opportunistic chances to create conversations, right? Because when I think about naturally being someone who is looked on in the eyes of society as being a male, being a tough guy, being somebody who doesn't complain, naturally we don't want to say, hey, I need some help, right? Or I need to talk to somebody because I'm feeling this way. It makes us seem lesser than. But when we have somebody in a key role, like a leader, a coach, or someone else who can start conversations about these things, and it gives us opportunities to contribute to that conversation, I feel like that's where we create the biggest change, because it needs to be something that is common, not something that is irregular.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, man. So in my line of work, it is like as a military officer, and this isn't necessarily a good thing, but there's like this underlying like ultra masculine ethos, and I think like our pioneering women that are in the organization are doing some things to help refine that a little bit so that it's not just like meatheadish. But one of the things that I have found to be very useful is that as I'm talking to leaders that maybe just don't quite really understand the mental health game, and they think it's like, hey, you just need to toughen up, quit being a little bitch and get going. You know, that sort of mentality. One of the lines that I use is exactly what you just said. It's like, nobody likes a complainer, right? Like if you're having a tough time, your job is not to complain about it. Your job is to do something about it. And so I'll talk to these leaders and I'll be like, do you want them to do something about it, or do you want them to just complain? And they're like, well, I want them to do something about it. And it's like, this is what they need to do in order to overcome it. Are you on board? And then they're all of a sudden like the light bulb goes off and they're, oh yeah, I am on board. It's like proactively taking care of yourself in the same way that I expect them to take care of their body with, you know, stretch routines or plyometric exercises or something like that. They're just building this skill set that will allow for them to be more resilient and a better teammate.
Yeah. I'm going to be a little bit selfish in the next question that I ask. So coming from the space that you come from, how do you overcome some of those preconceived notions that mental health, mental wellness is like a soft activity, especially when you're dealing with a generation of leaders who come from a tough-nosed generation? What are some of the challenges you face? And then do you face them head on by being like, hey, do we want complainers or do we want people to be proactive? Like, what is your approach, and do you have some frustrations in that space?
I think that I face it head on. And I aggressively challenge everybody that doesn't understand. I challenge their assumptions, and then I make them like repeat back to me what those assumptions are and why it is that they have them. And for Chimney Trail, it is vitally important that we get this right. And I don't know how interesting this will be to your listeners, but the reason for it is that we take for granted in our country something called the all-volunteer force. And it's this idea that 1% of the people are inspired in the same way that like clergy in the church might be inspired to adopt military service as a vocation and then to put themselves on the line to defend a country and its ideals. That has not always been the case. Like you were talking about Vietnam earlier, there were draftees to fight the war in Vietnam, and they were doing heroin when they got over there, you know? Like, not to say that like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't create their own like groundswell of drug use, but there is this core of people that is the all-volunteer force that we totally take for granted will be there tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And there are clear and present dangers. There are what they call pacing threats, like the People's Republic of China, Russia. You can see what's happening in Ukraine right now. The Department of Defense needs to keep their all-volunteer force because the sophistication of our weapon systems are becoming more and more sophisticated so quickly that you can't just randomly bring people into the military and expect them to be able to use those systems. So you always need to have this nucleus that's there to train people that you might need to bring in from other fields. If you don't preserve that force, then you lose the next war. Or you have a next war when you could have otherwise prevented it with good preparation. And so when I talk to military leaders and when I talk to people who just don't get it, I say, okay, you might not get mental health, but you do get the fact that our recruiting numbers are the worst that they've ever been. And the reason that they are the worst that they've ever been is that people are hearing about PTSD. They're hearing about military and veteran suicide. They're hearing about sexual harassment. They're hearing about like political agendas and this sort of thing. And it's all noise is what it is. We need to take care of the troops' mental health, give them the tools to know, hey, I'm getting ready to do just about the hardest job that there is. And so I need to prepare my brain for that reality. And then allow for them to go through their tenure of military service in a much more healthy state. And if you do that, then you get the influx of recruits that are able to sustain the force. And then you've got a really healthy all-volunteer force, which makes it so that people who mean us harm are too scared to do anything about it. So that's sort of the brass tacks of why it's so important and how I push back on folks that are just like, I don't get it, toughen up sort of thing.
And I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think that was incredibly well articulated. And it really kind of shines the light on some of the bigger issues that we have in like corporate culture today. It's like people are not going to want to come work for you if they hear that everybody has a negative experience, is burnt out, ends up having PTSD, dies by suicide. That's not a good branding exercise. And how can you expect for the people to want to show up, serve their country in the ways in which they should be, if they don't have the support from the organization or the cultural narrative is not supportive in nature? And I think that's just incredibly valuable. And thank you for articulating that. And I think that was a real value piece.
Heck yeah, man. I think, and I'm not suggesting that we need to become like a hug fest. Like everybody needs to be all soft and that's like a part, like let's take the Marine Corps, for example. A part of what makes the Marines is that you find a way or make one, or find a way or make one, right? Like Semper Fi, always faithful, take the hill. It's like this really aggressive, hard-nosed mentality. And there's a lot of value in that toughness. You need to be able to cultivate that toughness. And what our position is that it is impossible to become the real resilient form of toughness that you need if you are falling victim to cognitive distortions that cause anxiety and depression.
Absolutely. The two are connected, right? The two are connected. And I think we've taken a view in society that like our physical and our mental health are so separate rather than taking a view of us as a whole person. And that's so valuable. So Mathew, as we kind of wrap up here today, I want to give you an opportunity to let the listeners and the people who are viewing the show today know more about Chimney Trail. How can they find out more information? What type of projects are you excited about in the future? And how can we get behind you?
You got it. So first things first, if you're interested in what we're doing, shoot me an email. My email address is Mathew, Mathew, @chimneytrail.com. Chimney Trail spelled just like what's on my jacket. So our website, you can go to www.chimneytrail.com, and it gives you an idea of what it is that we do. But we are principally a government contracting company right now. And then also we provide services for businesses. So if you're a company and you want to materially improve the mental health of your force so that you have more resilient salespeople or better informed leadership, like with a higher emotional quotient, all those sorts of things, just visit our website and then shoot me an email, and we will set up a curriculum specifically for you. And you might be like, what comes in, like, what is this curriculum? And what you can expect is a 5-box series. We give you a box at the start of the curriculum and then mail you a box at the start of each new season, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And inside each kit, there is at least $100 worth of really quality outdoor equipment that you would normally get from a store like REI, for example. And that outdoor equipment is used to do an outdoor activity that teaches you about the 10 cognitive distortions that cause anxiety and depression. And it steps you through the activity in a way that addresses that distortion, and it allows for you to overcome it. And there's a book, like an instruction booklet, that's on the inside of the kit as well. So we'll give you the tools that you need in order to help your team overcome these cognitive distortions. And I promise you, at the end of it, you're going to be happy that you did it.
Well, I just want to say thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing a little bit about your lived experience and your passion for what you're doing, because for me, it is palpable. I can feel it through the screen, and I know everybody else can experience that as well. Guys, that's been another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. Once again, Mathew Brown, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Keenan.